Hello, I'm George Listencier. Welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Edward Gibbons opens the decline and fall of the Roman Empire by describing an empire that, at its height, comprised the fairest portion of mankind. Now, this is a sentiment that evokes the similar lyricism of that hymn to America's scenery and spirit, America the Beautiful. Yet another reminder of the countless ways in which modern America can be set beside ancient Rome for comparisons that enliven serious seminars and frivolous cocktail parties alike. The British Empire attracted a similar range of scrutiny in its heyday. But while the comparisons may be irresistible as entertainment, making them useful as guidance involves both a rigorous assessment of where things converge and diverge, and most importantly, what that might suggest about the America of tomorrow. My guest is Cullen Murphy, author of Are We Rome? The Fall of an Empire and the Fate of America. Cullen, welcome to Dialogue.
Great to be with you, George.
Cullen, let me hold up this handsome volume just to tell everyone what they probably already know. It's getting a lot of attention and being widely described as provocative and lively, and I agree with both those assessments. And Cullen, I guess that sets up my first question to you. You might call this the usage of history question. Comparisons between America and Rome have been perennial. Why is it useful to do it yet again? What's important? Why did you undertake this book at this time?
Well, you know, rationales always vary with time. The Founding Fathers obviously had Rome on their minds because they had just thrown off a tyranny. They had created a republic. They didn't want the young American Republic to go the way of the Roman Republic. These were people, as you know, who were deeply schooled in classical literature. And those concerns, I think, are on our minds today as well. What path is our republic going to take, you know, as a polity? But there's another set of questions, and they have to do with the question of America in the world.
Right.
So it's not the Roman Republic by itself, it's the Roman Empire that has our attention. I think it goes back really to the end of communism, when America emerged as the sole superpower, to use the cliche. Finally, we were on our own. We had to chart a new path in the world. We were being compared to the British Empire and to the Roman Empire.
Right.
So the subject is back in front of our eyes.
I like the way you phrase that. It strikes me that we've had sort of fashions, you might say, in our preoccupation with Rome, from the virtues of the Republic now to concerns about the dissolution of the empire, and are we in some ways in that danger? And right at the outset of the book, Cullen, I think you give us a very useful frame of reference for how to consider the major concerns that question poses. And let me see if I quote it correctly. That you think we should be, for example, less concerned about military might, more about our own sense of the world outside, more about sustaining our multi-ethnicity, and then, and I think finally, equally concerned about how that outside world views us. And I think that's a very effective range of concerns. My question to you, Cullen, is that having thought about those, as you suggest, it looks to me like we're in danger on every front. For example, many people are arguing, at least, that our society is extremely militarized, or becoming so, that with the immigration bill failing so recently, that our commitment to multi-ethnicity may be somewhat imperiled. And then finally, as you well know, almost every poll suggests anti-Americanism worldwide is at record heights. So, I mean, do you think that these concerns are particularly acute and dangerous for us now because of developments like that?
Yes, I do. It needs to be stated that Rome and America are obviously very different places, and you can make a lot of facile comparisons between these places. And I was not really interested in doing that. So I was trying to narrow down the focus to a handful of issues where I thought a parallel really does hold up. And you've articulated them very well. There's the issue of the way America views itself in the world, thinking that it's only our actions that matter, which is really a very Roman conception. There's this inability to get into the minds of foreigners and to understand how outsiders look at us, which led Rome into trouble lethal trouble on a number of occasions, and I think it's led us into trouble. We're seeing it in the newspaper headlines every single day. Those are almost, in a way, psychological issues. Then there's these very palpable issues of military power. Sure, we have a lot of it, but do we have enough of it for what we're trying to do? Arguably, we have the same problem that Rome did, which is our military is too small to do all the jobs we're giving it, too big to be easy to maintain. And then there's the matter of just the nature of our domestic government. It's a section that I devote to privatization.
Absolutely.
And who holds power? Where is the preponderance of power when you are trying to achieve things for the common good?
Absolutely.
Is it in private hands or is it in public hands? So these are some of the issues that I'm trying to get at.
You do. Popular attitudes to empire are one of the first things that struck me as I read this. For example, as you point out, the Roman Empire grew by both design and chance, and the incorporation of client states and many other ways. But at every stage, I got the impression the Romans were comfortable with being an empire. I mean, the Romans felt this is the way things should be. And as you might have suggested when you're talking about the fall of communism, maybe Americans are not so decided upon the worth of the exercise at all, or even the fact that they consider themselves an empire. Is there a certain uncertainty that contrasts with Rome?
It's easy to be comfortable with empire when you're more or less unconsciously expanding. There's that famous phrase about Great Britain having acquired an empire in a fit of absence of mind. In many ways, the situation that the United States finds itself in now is not entirely consciously of its own making. After World War II, a war that we were drawn into, we found ourselves having to pick up the pieces in a shattered world.
Right.
Our status is largely the result of that. Of course, we consciously pursued the Cold War. We emerged victorious and so on. We never set out saying, let's have an empire,
right.
Fellas. With the fall of communism, we found ourselves really for the first time where we were facing options. We actually had to think deliberately, now what do we do? Right. And this is when the empire talk really was in front of us again.
Right.
There's a lot of ambivalence about this, and opinion is divided, to be totally simplistic about it, between those who think we should really go for it, setbacks like Iraq perhaps, to the side, and those who have fundamental qualms about the entire enterprise.
And I think it's a very useful characterization, and it almost leads to my next question. In fact, you hit right on it. Just to take the subject of empire itself, almost abstractly, is there a beneficent 21st century defense of it? I mean, for those who would take that side of it, says, well, America should unapologetically exercise this worldwide power, is that a defensible argument? There's a beneficent leadership role that empire can play, even in this troubled world.
Well, I actually think that Neil Ferguson makes it very, very well in his book, Colossus. Yes, you can make the argument that somebody needs to step in and perform a certain range of functions. You need a great power, to keep the sea lanes free, or you need a few great powers to do it. And I certainly have no objection to the United States playing that role. I support it. My concern, though, is that if the United States attempts unilaterally to do this, that we'll be doing it to the neglect of things that really underlie our power, which is our domestic government, for instance.
And that there again, I think you make some extraordinary points. Let me try to go into some of them. For example, the use of power. Rome went from a monarchy to a republic to a dictatorship and ultimately to dissolution. Although you very, I think, appropriately point out, we're not, to say that Rome fell is perhaps a question of definition. Rome's influence in many ways still persists.
Yes, you can argue for forever, and in fact, historians have been arguing for centuries over just what those words, the fall of Rome, meant. And I've often wondered, how Rome technically fell towards the end of the 5th century. The Western Empire fell. how many people at the time knew it? You know, if you'd went to people on the street and said, by the way, did you hear Rome fell? You know, it would have been news to an awful lot of people, and their lives would not actually have changed.
Well, and you point out that a lot of the instead of that kind of Cecil B. DeMille horde of barbarians or Visigoths hitting the gates, that there was sort of a by increment these losses of battles and declines. And of course, every time you set down a word, we're using the Roman alphabet, so the
exactly. So it's this kind of slow disintegration that you might not even notice in your own lifetime, but you notice from the perspective of 200, 300 years.
Right.
That, I think, is the worry for an entity like the United States.
So let's take that worry and apply it to the use of power sort of situation. And I'm going to go over the top with this question, but the leaders of Rome assuming dictatorial power really was, at least I think, the start of a lot of its decline, or at least arguably so. And here comes the heroic contrast. We talk today of an imperial presidency. We talk of the Congress not always perhaps playing the strong role it should in governance. Is the action of a legislature in a system like this one of the barometers of how we may be on that power dissolution spectrum?
Well, that is the worry, and you know, the legislature always seems to be the first to go. I was in a Q&A the other day, and the subject of executive-legislative relations came up with respect to Rome and ourselves. And I was kind of blindsided by the question because it ended with, so what do you think about the way the way Congress is trying to take away executive power, which of course is the opposite of the way that I would see it these days. There has unquestionably been a flow of power towards the executive at the expense of Congress as an institution. Now, whether this means in a century that Congress will be kind of an irrelevant appendage, a bit of window dressing up on the Hill, I don't know. That certainly is what happened to Rome. The Senate became, you know, in effect a millionaire's club without much function, and all power really was in the hands of the executive.
But what you're saying is we should be concerned about. This is one of the things for us to watch closely.
This is one of the classical worries of the founders, that this would happen. It is not one of the new worries. And you know, when Lincoln was assassinated, that was John Wilkes Booth's worry too, from a secessionist and racist point of view. But that has always been one of the great concerns. I don't think it has been really a valid concern until relatively recently.
Another traditional concern, which may be more acute in our time, is, as you indicated earlier, military power and its use. And I think we have to introduce a couple of Greek words here. Oikoumene?
Which is the known world.
The Greek word for it. The Roman known world was obviously much smaller than ours, but maybe some of the problems are the same. And you talked about their dependence on military might and an ever-declining pool of people to use for that purpose. And I guess the way we phrase that now is guns and butter.
That's right.
And so do you think that is another of the areas in which we have to start looking more closely at what we're doing?
Sure. The word, by the way, that you were using there is the word that is the antecedent of our word ecumenical.
Ah, that's right, yeah.
Just so you... Rome had in its final centuries, had a terrible manpower problem. It just could not get enough people of its own from within the empire to do the number of chores that needed to be done, including domestic chores. You know, there was legislation that would require people to stay in their jobs over generations. So if your father had a particular was a baker,
right,
you had to be a baker, and so on. Now, whether these were enforced is another matter, but it just shows you the extent of the problem. And ultimately, what Rome had to do is hire people to do some of these jobs. And the people that they hired, because they had no choice, were from outside the empire. The people we call barbarians, and that some politically correct historians now call immigrants, which I think is a justifiable term in many cases. But they hired Visigoths or Huns and many other groups to do things. And sometimes that was effective, and often it was necessary because there was no other choice. But in the long term, it was not a very happy solution in terms of the integrity of the empire.
Right.
So, now, are we doing this with hiring contractors to complement our military? I would argue that, in fact, there's a very clear analogy.
Well, that leads us to the two next subjects are linked to that, because privatization and the issue of borders and immigrants are directly connected to what you're saying now. On the privatization issue, you're absolutely right. I mean, if you looked at Iraq right now, I think the second largest military force there is the privately contracted.
That's right.
Bodyguards, or
100,000.
100,000 of them. And you can take that in many directions. Another thing to say about privatization is it's not just the military. The government's using it in so many other ways. Maybe one quickly focused question on it is that potentially or actually at risk of undermining yet again our notions of the common good? I mean, is that what you sacrifice if we go too far in that one direction?
I was looking at the newspaper this morning, and there was a picture of the former governor of my state, Massachusetts, coming out of an office in the State House, and he was there lobbying the current administration to sell the Mass Turnpike and the Mass Lottery to private hands. Now, this kind of activity, selling off government functions to the private sector, is occurring everywhere. Whether it's prisons or water systems, school systems, you can just see the slow creep towards privatization. The military we've already talked about. There isn't an element of government where the pull towards privatization is not occurring. Now, why is this bad is the question. And it may be that case by case, it's not bad. You look at the narrow situation and you decide, that makes a lot of sense. Why should the government be doing this? The private sector can do it much more cheaply, much more efficiently. Let's let them do it. So I concede that. But you add all these things together, and what you have done is government has lost the capacity to act decisively.
Right.
And this almost certainly happened in Rome, and I think it's happening before our eyes right now.
Well, I think I just have to say I think that's well said, quite frankly. Another point you make, and I think it's related to almost all the points that you make here, and you alluded to it early in the conversation, was the Roman arrogance that led them to sort of emphasize their power, particularly their military power. There was a decisive battle, and I hope I pronounced this correctly, at the Teutoburg Forest in Germany, where they came a cropper because a German general named Arminius.
It gives us the current name Hermann.
Hermann comes from
Right.
that. Well, another name that might come from that in a kind of odd associative way, I thought as I read this, is Ho Chi Minh, because it seems to me he had the same sort of
tactics certainly as Arminius.
As Arminius did. But also because perhaps our arrogance, our hubris led us to underestimate what Ho Chi Minh might ultimately achieve. Speak to us a bit about that. I mean, this sense of America, and it's one of your original important points, our misunderstanding, misinterpretation of the outside world.
Well, let me just quickly fill in the Teutoburg Forest story. The situation was that Rome had expanded nearly to what its frontiers were going to be, but they didn't have Germany. And they thought it would be nice to have Germany. So they took steps to begin to annex this as a new province, everything beyond the Rhine and the Danube. And they thought it was going very well. They thought that these primitive peoples would be only too glad to accept Roman civilization. And if you read people talking at the time, the way they talk about it, it's they're not talking about how this is going to be a cakewalk, to use a phrase from not too long ago. But they did use the phrase breezing right in as if on a picnic. And so at one point they sent 3 Roman legions up there, and again they thought they were simply going to be occupying a place. And they got their heads handed to them. I mean, literally had their heads handed to them in a terrible ambush where these 3 legions were slaughtered over the course of 3 or 4 days. It was the most catastrophic defeat that Rome had suffered as an empire. And it really resulted from this attitude towards the outside world, seeing the outsider as someone inferior. You can't be our equal. Why should we Why should we care?
I remember now from the book, do you use the phrase an ideology of the foreigner? Sort of the sense that, just by definition, those not Roman are less than those who are Roman.
Well, that's why there's the term barbarian. You know, if you were not of us, you know, you are the barbarian. It's an idea that is taken over from the Greeks, who had the same view, and yeah, you sometimes hear people talking today about the unwashed. Yeah. It's the same notion.
It is the same notion, and it comes actually to another of the points I want to talk about here, immigration. And immigration in the Roman sense, I think, in this book is treated in their notion of borders. You make an interesting point about Hadrian's Wall in Scotland, which I've yet to get to, but that it is permeable. There are places periodically where they expected people
every
to come
mile.
Through. Yeah, which raised, I guess, in a sort of a quick fashion, this notion of borderlessness, of a nation being open to people and influences, which is what I think we should be.
I certainly tilt in that direction. I mean, no, I don't think the border should be meaningless, nor can they be. But thinking of the current immigration debate, the way you hear a lot of rhetoric about how we have to seal the border, and I think that is a pipe dream. The Romans neither sealed the border, nor did they have total laissez-faire. The border region was a dynamic zone, as the American border really is right now. The great thing about Rome, and where its real strength lay, and where I would argue our real strength lies, is its ability to serve as an assimilation machine. Over the course of the empire, Rome expanded to embrace tens of millions of people who were not Romans. And at the same time, many millions of people came into the empire who were not Romans. But Rome's culture and its organizational skill were such that people bought into Rome very quickly. Rome had so much to offer. It was stable. It was economically vibrant, and so people bought into it relatively quickly. That is what people do with the United States, I believe, and I suspect will continue to do if we keep our domestic society healthy.
Right. And in fact, and like to sort of give people a sense of the style of this book, I think you make that point by using the historical contrast, but also personal family history, as showing how people come to this country and become Americans.
That's right. I was thinking at one point about, what is the character of a frontier society? What are its demographics like? And then I was, if you were on the Roman frontier, there would be this very interesting mix of people. And you'd have some Romans there, but all sorts of combinations. And you can actually, if you look in the literature, you can see this. But I was thinking of my own situation where my wife is half Mexican, and her father came over in 1920. He was an infant, and we have his immigration papers. There's a little card, and it says mode of arrival on this printed card, and then typed in it says rowboat, which I'm bowled over every time I see that. And so here you have someone coming from, let's call it outside the empire, into the empire by rowboat. Now, just at that very time, a little bit earlier, a couple of years earlier, my own grandfather, Irish, whose own ancestors had come into the empire previously by a different kind of boat, he was with General Pershing's army going into Mexico to fight Pancho Villa, and it struck me as being a very, Roman kind of situation.
I think it's a marvelous story, absolutely marvelous story. And what it really suggests to me is if we're, and the general tenor of the things that you've been saying, Cullen, if we're confident enough to believe in our, what we might call national character, certainly the constitutional structure, we'll be all right. We live up to that. I mean, to the extent that we seek to remain open, an assimilative nation will be well placed for the 21st century. Any restrictions on that are?
I believe that, but that leaves substantial work in front of us to do. We have, for instance, I think we have to stop selling off the government. We have to start taking pride again in the handful of very large things that government can do well. And we need to ask the government to do them and support the government. I think the idea of national service is an idea that has long since arrived, and would be one of the legs of this assimilationist society that we need to foster. All the investment in schools that we're not getting, we should be. You hear debates from time to time when people are wondering, well, gee, should the children of people who are here illegally be allowed to get in-state tuition? I would say yes. This only makes us stronger.
Well, once again, I have to say I fully agree with you. And as we come to the end of the conversation, I was struck by your advice to us at the conclusion of this book to do precisely those things and a number of other things very much like them. It just struck me that perhaps our internal ability to do that may mean reining in some of our notions of exceptionalism and sort of seeing ourselves as part of a larger world picture as well. For example, you advise us to start playing soccer.
Well, just looking at my own family, when I think about what has increased awareness of the world, soccer on television has done a darn good job right there. I meant that kind of jokingly, but that knowledge of the world is something that we need to improve on.
Once again, I'm in full agreement, and I want to once again recommend everyone that they get their hands on this book and form their own opinions. And I think they'll agree that the author is a very wise man indeed. Thank you very much, Cullen Murphy.
George, it's been great to be back with you.
My pleasure. And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHC Networks. Dialogue is also on the MHC Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to www.mhcworldview.org. Please join us again right here next week, and thank you for watching this week. Cullen, thank you.
Thanks a lot. I'm very, very glad.